There's a sleep lab in Virginia that has a database of over 400 offenders. They know which ones will reoffend within 6 months. They've known for years. The courts don't ask for the data. You think violence is a series of conscious choices, one bad decision after another. What if the decision was already made hours before the trigger, while the brain was supposed to be offline? The scan begins in total darkness. The subject's eyes are closed. Blood oxygen level dependent signals flicker across the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. This isn't a crime scene photo, it's a map of a system that is already malfunctioning while the person is unconscious. And the data doesn't lie. Here's what the fMRI reveals about a psychopath's sleep. The normal restorative cycle is broken. The latency to REM is shortened by an average of 34 minutes compared to controls. That's a measurable biological deviation, not a moral failing. But the scan doesn't stop there. The delta wave activity, the deep stage 3 and 4 sleep that clears metabolic waste and regulates emotional memory, is suppressed by nearly 40%. The brain isn't resting, it's running hot, trapped in a low-level insomnia that reshapes every waking decision. The threshold was visible on the polysomnograph long before any crime occurred. The question is why no one was watching. If that sleep signature shifted the frame for you, if you felt the ground move under everything you thought you knew about impulse and intent, subscribe now because the next scan we examine will reveal the exact moment the break fails in real time. Drop the word delta in the comments when you catch what your own sleep cycle might be hiding. You've read the headlines, you've seen the case files. You've heard the explanations: childhood trauma, antisocial personality disorder, a lack of empathy. Those are descriptors, not mechanisms. They describe what happened. They don't describe how the wiring drove the hand. Consider the sleep log of an offender studied at the University of Pennsylvania in 1985. Over 30 days, his REM latency averaged 42 minutes. The control group averaged 92 minutes. He reported no subjective sense of sleep deprivation. He said he felt fine. But his brain was accumulating a debt that expressed itself not as fatigue, but as a lowered threshold for the impulse cycle. The flashpoint arrived faster because the brake was already worn thin. If you've ever read a forensic assessment and felt the explanation didn't match the weight of the act, you know that gap, the space between what we say causes violence and what the scan actually shows. That gap is where the neurology lives. The Dundon longitudinal study tracked this exact trajectory. 1,037 children followed for 32 years. Low delta wave activity at age 3 predicted aggression at age 18. Not bad parenting, not poverty. A measurable biological marker, present before language developed. The machine caught it. The environment dictated the expression, which raises a question the archives don't want you to find. If the hardware is damaged before the child can speak, what exactly are we punishing when the adult acts? But here's where the scan breaks the narrative. You might assume that a psychopath's sleep disruption is simple hyperarousal, a brain that can't shut down because it's wired for constant threat detection. That fits the conventional image of the predator, always scanning, never at rest. The polysomnograph says something more disturbing. The sleep disruption isn't always hyperarousal. Sometimes it's an absence of the mechanism that normally links emotion to memory consolidation. Imagine a brain that dreams of violence but wakes up feeling nothing. The amygdala doesn't encode the emotional weight of the imagery during REM because the connectivity between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex is structurally reduced. The dream is a crime scene. The waking response is cold curiosity. That's not a failure of morality. That's a broken circuit in the wiring diagram of conscience. And this changes how we read every case that followed. You now have enough to see the full architecture forming. And if you want to be inside the room where the patterns are assembled before the headlines distort them, subscribe to Stay Wired into the archive. Comment with cold curiosity if you've ever felt that gap between what someone says and what the data reveals. The threshold for the impulse cycle isn't crossed in a moment of rage. It's lowered night after night, sleep cycle after sleep cycle, until the latency between thought and action collapses. Every homicide that appears impulsive on the surface may have been prepared by 1,000 sleep stages that didn't restore. You now know more about what actually drives a killer's brain than 90% of the people who sit on juries. They hear about motive, they hear about intent. They never hear about the delta wave suppression that preceded the trigger pull by 11 years. The evidence anchor here is the 2002 study of sleep architecture in 23 violent offenders conducted at the Mind Research Network in Albuquerque. Kent Keel's lab used a combination of polysomnography and structural MRI. They found that PCLR scores above 29 correlated with a 28% reduction in slow-wave sleep density, not total sleep time, not subjective quality, the density of the deep restorative wave. That's a signal that can't be faked. That's a fingerprint of the broken circuit. And the scan has been sitting in the archive since 2003. No court has requested it. No parole board has cited it. The data predicts reoffense risk with a 78% accuracy rate in the lab. In the courtroom, it doesn't exist. Think about that for a second. We have a biological marker that identifies the mechanism of violence better than a psychological interview. And we pretend that the interview is enough, which brings us to the paradox at the heart of the investigation. The same neural attenuation that predicts violence also predicts a specific form of vulnerability. Offenders with the most severe delta wave suppression are also the most likely to develop psychotic symptoms under conditions of chronic sleep restriction. The same brain that can't access emotional depth during REM also cracks under the pressure of its own unregulated threat detection circuitry. This isn't a simple predator narrative. This is a broken homeostatic system. The scan reveals a brain that isn't evil. It's just running on corrupted firmware, repeating a cycle it can't exit because the repair mechanism, slow-wave sleep, is blocked at the hardware level. And here's the confrontation that changes how you read every headline going forward. If the sleep disruption is congenital, visible on the first polysomnograph at age 10, then the trajectory of violence may be fixed before any intervention arrives. The criminal justice system processes the outcome. It never audits the wiring. You've been told that justice is about accountability. What if accountability is impossible when the brain never learned to regulate itself because the off switch was broken at the root? That's the open loop that keeps me returning to the archive. The scan in front of me is from a subject whose PCLR measured exactly what the delta wave density predicted, every time. The pattern doesn't miss. The archive doesn't lie. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next dissection, the case where the scan predicted the exact date of reoffense. Leave the word predictive in the comments if you want the legal system to start seeing what the machine already shows. Let me show you what the scan actually lights up. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex is normally active during emotional regulation tasks. In the psychopath's brain, it's almost silent during REM. The region that says, stop before you act, doesn't receive the signal because the amygdala never sent it. The impulse cycle has no break because the brake line was severed during the sleep stage that should have been the maintenance window. And this is where the wiring breaks. The flashpoint isn't a moment, it's a cumulative failure. Each night of abbreviated REM sleep adds a voltage to the system. By the time the trigger event arrives, the threshold is so low that any stimulus, a perceived insult, a blocked gaze, a raised voice, trips the circuit. The conscious mind doesn't choose violence. The conscious mind is watching a system that already committed the act before the prefrontal cortex could mount a response. If you've ever read a crime report and felt the perpetrator's explanation was hollow, you were right. The explanation is reconstructed after the fact. The real cause was written in the sleep architecture hours before. But the scan doesn't stop there. It shows something even more unsettling. Broken circuit isn't limited to offenders with high PCLR scores. It appears in a subset of the general population who have never committed a violent act. The sleep disruption is present. The neural attenuation is measurable. The environment never provided the triggering variable. That means the hardware alone doesn't determine the outcome. It determines the threshold. The threshold is the risk. The environment is the switch. We've been looking at the switch and ignoring the threshold. The threshold was sitting in the actigraphy data all along. Let me close this layer with a question that keeps the loop open. If we can identify children with the sleep signature that predicts future violence with 78% accuracy, and we do nothing and they act, who is responsible? The child who never learned to regulate a system they couldn't feel, or the system that ignored the scan? The answer is uncomfortable. That's why the archive stays closed. Here's what the fMRI reveals that most researchers won't say aloud. We've known about this connection for over 2 decades. The first paper linking REM latency to psychopathy was published in 1998. The replication studies followed, the meta-analyses confirmed. And the legal system absorbed exactly none of it. The scan exists, the data is peer-reviewed, the mechanism is mapped. But the courtroom operates on a model of human behavior that was obsolete before the first fMRI machine was ever built. You've been told that justice is about understanding the mind. It's not. It's about assigning blame to a narrative, and a narrative cannot be scanned, which raises a final question that doesn't resolve neatly. If the sleep disruption is treatable, if targeted interventions can restore slow wave density and raise the impulse threshold, then we have a biological off switch for violence that has never been implemented at scale. The studies exist. The protocols exist. The prisons are full of people whose brains never received the repair cycle. The threshold wasn't crossed in a moment of rage. It was lowered by 1,000 nights of broken sleep before the trigger was ever pulled. The scan has been sitting in the archive since 2003. Nobody's looking at it. The broken circuit doesn't care about your moral framework. It doesn't respond to punishment. It responds to the same mechanism that kept it running in the first place, a system that refused to see the data because the data complicates the story. And the story was never the point. The wiring was. The data complicates the story because it strips away the comforting illusion of evil as a choice and replaces it with a mechanical failure that demands a response, not a sentence. The cold steel of the evidence table holds a folder of scans from 2003. The ink has faded. The case numbers are illegible. But the signal patterns remain sharp. The same attenuated delta waves, the same shortened REM latency, the same broken circuit that appeared in every offender studied since. But if you're sitting there wondering what this means for the next headline you read, the answer is, it means you can no longer read the headline the same way. You've seen the wiring. You've traced the impulse cycle back to its origin in the sleep stage that was supposed to repair it. You know that the question isn't whether the brain can be blamed, but whether the system that ignored the scan can claim ignorance. The archivist pulls another folder from the shelf. The polysomnograph is dated 1987. The subject was 7 years old. The pattern is identical. The crime came 23 years later. The scan has always been there. The question was never whether the evidence existed. The question was whether we would look. We do not look away.